In a quiet village wrapped in the soft sigh of morning mists and faded memories, a girl named Belle lived at the edge of an overgrown garden where roses bloomed in defiance of the seasons and vines curled like tendrils of forgotten dreams. Her home was modest, but lined with shelves of old books and blank canvases, each waiting for the colors that only visited her in sleep. Belle was known by the townspeople as peculiar but kind of dreamer who painted things no one else could see. Her father, Maurice, a gentle, eccentric inventor with silver-threaded hair and spectacles perpetually slipping down his nose, spent his days tinkering with clocks that never quite worked and music boxes that played lullabies in reverse. Their cottage buzzed with the soft chaos of creativity, but at night, when the village stilled and moonlight blanketed the world in silver hush, Belle would drift into dreams far more vivid than reality. In these dreams, she walked through a castle suspended in time, where chandeliers dripped light like honey, and a rose glowed beneath a glass dome, untouched by wind or season. She would wake with her heart full and her hands aching to capture what she'd seen in strokes of paint and light. One morning, she awoke to find her father's workbench empty and his tools scattered as if dropped mid-motion. The fire had gone out, the kettle was cold, and the small clock he had been restoring ticked backwards. Belle waited through the day, sitting by the window, with her eyes trained on the path that led into the forest. Maurice had spoken the night before of a merchant from the north bringing rare brass gears, and he had set out early with promises to return before dusk. But dusk passed, and then the full sweep of night fell, and still he did not return. As the stars brightened, Belle paced the cottage, something deeper than worry thrumming in her chest. The forest beyond their home, long abandoned by woodcutters and wanderers, was rumored to be cursed, though no one could quite remember why. It had swallowed travelers before. Some said an old manor stood beyond the thorns, crumbling and cursed, wrapped in ivy and sorrow, but no one dared go close. Yet when morning came and Maurice was still gone, Belle packed a satchel with bread, a scarf, and a compass that always pointed west, even when held upside down. She left a note on the hearth, pulled her cloak tight, and stepped into the whispering woods. The path quickly vanished, overtaken by creeping roots and low fog. Birds watched from twisted branches, silent as statues. The deeper Belle went, the more time seemed to slip sideways, the sun caught in a perpetual early morning, casting long, soft shadows that never moved. Hours passed her, perhaps minutes, until she stumbled into a clearing not marked on any map. There, half buried in ivy and snowdrop blooms, stood a gate wrought of black iron and moonstone. It was ajar. Beyond it loomed a forest within a forest, one not of bark and leaf, but of marble statues and stone trees frozen in bloom. As she stepped through the gate, her breath caught, the wind stopped, the compass she carried began to spin, and then, rising beyond the petrified trees, she saw it, the castle from her dreams, real and breathing. It soared with impossible towers, veiled in mist, its spires half vanished into clouds that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. The sky above it was a strange color, too deep for blue, too soft for violet, as if time had painted it with forgotten names. The main gate was open, though no footprints marred the frost at her feet. Belle moved forward, each step echoing louder than it should, as if the place itself listened. The foyer yawned wide, lit by a chandelier of stars, not glass, their light glimmering on faded tapestries that danced with scenes that shifted when she wasn't looking. She called out for her father, but only her own voice answered, muffled and distant. As she explored deeper, doors opened before she touched them, hallways reconfigured behind her, and the castle seemed to breathe in silence. In a sunlit greenhouse overtaken by wild roses and birdsong that sounded like forgotten lullabies, she found her father not trapped, not harmed, but asleep in a chair, as if lulled into dream. When she shook him awake, he looked upon her with confusion, then fear, urging her to flee. But as they turned toward the exit, the ground trembled. From the shadows emerged a creaturia figure, not quite man, not quite beast, tall and broad, cloaked in a velvet robe worn with age, horns curling from his brow like ancient oak branches. His voice rumbled not from his throat, but from the walls themselves, as he demanded to know why they had come. Belle stood in front of her father, her eyes unflinching even as her knees threatened to buckle, and she offered herself in her father's place. The creature fell silent. Then, after a long pause that seemed to stretch the walls farther apart, he agreed. Belle would remain. Her father would be returned to the village safely. With a flick of his clawed hand, Morris disappeared in a gust of wind scented like lavender and ash. Belle remained. The castle, once merely strange, seemed to shift in temperature. The hallways grew warmer, the portraits brighter, the long silent music drifting faintly through the halls once more. Belle wandered alone the first few days, her steps echoing in the gilded silence. The creature whom she now called the Beast appeared only in brief glimpses, his presence more shadow than substance. At night, she dreamed not only of the rose, but of a boy, with bright eyes turned dark, a throne carved of bone and wood, and a woman cloaked in stormlight who whispered warnings into his ear. When she woke, she found her paintings more vivid than ever before. She painted the castle's changing light, the beast's silhouette beneath a crimson moon, the rose glowing in its case with petals suspended mid-fall. She began speaking to the empty rooms as she painted, telling stories aloud, recalling her village, her favorite books, the sound of her father's laugh. She didn't know the beast listened. On the seventh night, she found a book in the castle library that hadn't been there before. Its pages were blank, but when she touched them, her dream from the night before appeared, each brushstroke exact. The castle was listening not just to her voice, but to her dreams. The library became her sanctuary, a place of shifting shelves and whispering stories. She began reading aloud each night, her voice the only sound in the great, echoing halls. And somewhere, beyond the velvet curtains, the beast listened. One evening she asked, not expecting an answer, "Why do you hide?" And the answer came low and trembling. "Because I was not always a monster, but I have always been afraid." The words came not from a mouth, but from a mirror that bloomed with frost as he spoke. The castle, too, was filled with fear, a fear so old that it turned into silence. Belle didn't press him. Instead, she left him a book the next night, open to a story of a lonely king who turned his palace into a forest to hide from his own reflection. Slowly, things began to shift. The halls grew less cold, the paintings stopped moving. Belle began to see the beast more clearly, not just a towering silhouette, but a creature shaped by grief. His voice grew steadier. He asked questions. He listened. He told her one night about the rose that had bloomed in time, not soil, and that when the last petal fell, he would vanish like smoke and wind. Belle asked what the rose meant, and he said it was what remained of his heart. He did not tell her who had taken it, or why. But Belle sensed that this place was not simply cursed, it was suspended. The story paused mid-sentence. The castle was a memory refusing to end. One morning, Belle awoke to find her canvas already half-painted. A castle bathed in golden light. A figure standing in the tower window watching her. The wind carried a new sound through the halls. A clock ticking, faint but steady. Time had begun again, and as she stood at the window of her tower chamber, watching the first snow fall through golden light, she whispered a quiet truth that she didn't yet understand fully. That the place she had feared might be a prison was something else entirely, a waiting heart, hidden inside a dream, and in the very center of it, untouched by season or sorrow, the rose still glowed. The days slipped past like candle wax under soft flame, and Belle began to lose count of how long she had been within the castle's shifting walls. Time did not behave here. as it did in the world she had known. Mornings often came without warning, and evenings arrived mid-conversation. Sometimes the sun lingered in the sky for what felt like hours, painting the stained glass windows with halos of ruby and gold. Sometimes it vanished entirely, leaving the halls to glow with their own kind of quiet magic. The castle was a creature of memory and mood. It listened, it responded, and it changed not in great sweeping gestures, but in subtle ways, like how a familiar room would suddenly appear warmer after she laughed, or how a hidden passage revealed itself when she wished to be alone. She began to learn the language of the place not with words, but with instinct and emotion. The walls spoke in sighs, the windows blinked in sunlight, and the mirrors sometimes hummed softly when she passed, catching reflections not quite her own. She wandered not as a prisoner, but as an invited guest in a forgotten world that seemed to exhale around her. In the mornings, she would walk the gardens, where flowers bloomed in impossible colors, and the breeze carried the scent of apples and memory. Once she found a sundial with no shadow, another time a staircase that led to the edge of a cloud, and always there was the rose, floating beneath its glass dome in a room that was neither warm nor cold, suspended in a stillness that made her chest ache. The petals, she noticed, were fewer now. Each one that fell seemed to hush the air itself. The beast was a presence more than a companion in those early days. He moved like wind behind stone-just glimpses and archways, a low voice from the far end of a hall, the sound of his steps like drums softened by moss. But Belle sensed his eyes often. He watched, not like a captor, but like a man uncertain if he was allowed to be seen. Once, she found a trail of books left outside her door, stories of faraway oceans, of starfolk and dream riders, of cursed kings and red-threaded fates. Another time, a single candle flickered to life beside her when she sighed in the dark. She realized he was listening, not just to her words, but to her silences. She began to talk aloud as she walked, not out of loneliness but habit. She spoke to the paintings, the trees, the staircases that sometimes sighed under her feet, and occasionally, when she asked a question, an answer would float back gruff and careful, like the voice had forgotten how to shape kindness. They never saw each other properly, not yet, but they began to speak through space and shadow. She asked why the east wing was sealed. He asked why she feared mirrors. She asked what the rose was made of. He asked what her dreams looked like. Each answer was a little door opening, a flicker of trust. In the vast dining hall, she sometimes ate alone beneath a chandelier of crystal birds frozen mid-flight, the beast absent but his chair pushed back, as though he had stood quickly and disappeared. Other times, she found her meals replaced with her favorite dishes: rosemary bread, baked apples, tea steeped in orange peel and cinnamon, though she had never mentioned them aloud. Once, the tea had a note tucked beneath the cup. It read, "This one reminds me of laughter I have not heard in a long time." She held that note in her palm long after the tea had gone cold. One afternoon, in a corridor she had never noticed before, Belle stumbled upon a gallery filled with statues. Some were beautiful, their marble faces serene, their poses graceful. Others were haunting, twisted in expressions of surprise or sorrow, their hands reaching out as if frozen mid-motion. At the far end of the room stood a sculpture different from the rest, not marble but obsidian, not of a person but of a massive clawed hand outstretched toward a figure made of wind and fire. The plaque beneath it had no name, only a word in a language Belle didn't know, though it stirred something in her chest, a flicker of cold recognition. That night her dreams changed. No longer did she walk the castle in light. She stood on balconies with broken railings, looked down at a battlefield of ash and rose petals, and watched a young man crumble as shadows coiled around his heart. She woke with tears drying on her cheek, and found her painting already begun on the canvas beside her bed. It was the man again, the one from her dreams, the one who had become the beast. His face, half shrouded in smoke, but his eyes were unmistakable. Not monstrous, just lost. The next evening, as she walked through the great hall, the beast spoke aloud for the first time without hiding. His voice came from behind a column, rough but steady. "You painted me," he said. Belle turned, not startled, and replied, "I didn't mean to." There was a long pause. "It's not a cruel painting," he said at last. "No," she answered, "it isn't." And then he stepped into view. He was larger than she had imagined, draped in layers of dark fabric that moved like smoke around him. Horns curled back from his head, not sharp but elegant, like twisted roots. His eyes glowed faintly, but not with anger, with weariness. Scars laced his fur in patterns that suggested more than violence, ritual, maybe. A transformation, perhaps. His posture was not threatening but unsure, like someone who had forgotten how to stand without armor. She didn't flinch. He didn't retreat. They looked at each other for a long moment, and something silent passed between them, not trust, not yet, but the willingness to try. They began to meet more often, sometimes for meals, sometimes just to talk. His voice was heavy with old sorrows, but also with careful interest. He asked her about painting, about her village, about books she loved. She asked about the enchantment, but he spoke little of that. He told her instead about stars that used to fall into the garden, about a room where dreams took shape, and about a library that once sang songs in the language of trees. Belle realized he had not always been lonely, but had been alone long enough to forget the difference. In the weeks that followed, the castle bloomed around them. Vines pulled back from windows. Light lingered longer in rooms. Bells chimed softly when she smiled. The staff half-seen spirits of candlelight, wind and wood grew bolder, shyly helpful. A book would be opened for her before she touched it, a cup of tea refilled before she reached for it. Once, a hummingbird made entirely of light perched on her shoulder and whispered a lullaby from a land she'd never known. But still, the rose withered, slowly, steadily, one petal every few days. The dome that held it shimmered more faintly now. Belle began to feel its rhythm, like a heartbeat, echoing in reverse. The beast avoided it, his voice tightening when she mentioned it, his eyes growing distant. When she asked directly what would happen when the last petal fell, he only said, "I will no longer dream, and this place will sleep forever." One evening she found him in the west garden, standing beneath a silver tree that grew upside down, its roots tangled in the sky. He was silent as she approached. "You knew I would come," she said. "Yes," he replied, "because you always walk where things are quietest." She sat beside him in the grass, and they watched the stars shimmer through the branches. "Do you miss who you were?" she asked gently. "I miss forgetting who I am," he said. They were quiet then, not from discomfort, but from the kind of silence shared only by those who understand it. That night, Belle returned to the gallery of statues. She stared at the obsidian hand and the wind figure. This time, the plaque was readable, a single word: remember. The next morning, the castle was different. Not darker, but more fragile. Cracks spidered through the walls of certain corridors. A tapestry wept ink. The rose had shed another petal, and the air tasted faintly of endings. Belle knew something was unraveling, something hidden. The beast had told her that time within the castle was a mercy, that it kept things from breaking. But now time was waking, and the truth, she suspected, would not remain hidden much longer. She painted again that day, but the image did not come from a dream. It came from a feeling, a door opening at the heart of something long sealed. And behind that door, a boy with a heart made of light still beating, still waiting to be found. The morning began with a strange hush, the kind that made the birds forget to sing and the wind pause before touching the leaves. Belle awoke not to sunlight, but to an amber glow that filled her room like candlelight beneath water. Outside her window, the sky was veined with gold. like cracks in porcelain trying to hold back something ancient. The castle, always shifting and secretive, seemed to hold its breath. She dressed slowly, choosing a soft blue shawl she hadn't worn in weeks, and stepped into the corridor, where the air felt warmer than usual, heavier, as if it remembered something it could not quite speak. She followed the scent of roses and smoke, her steps light, but her heart quickened with every turn of the hall. In the northern wing, where the ceilings were high and the tapestries longer than stories, she found a new door. It hadn't been there the day before, she was sure. Carved from pale wood and etched with constellations, the door stood slightly ajar. Belle hesitated only a moment before pushing it open. Inside was a small circular chamber bathed in amber light. The walls were covered in mirrors, but not ordinary ones. Each seemed to reflect not her, but moments. In one, she saw her father laughing as he adjusted a clock. In another, a younger version of herself dancing through a field of dandelions. Another showed a dream she had forgotten, a boy with a crown made of thorns, offering her a rose that pulsed with life. The mirrors, she realized, did not show the past or the future, but memory itself, the living kind, the kind shaped by feeling rather than fact. At the center of the room stood a pedestal. On it, a book bound in red velvet. It opened as she approached, its pages fluttering without wind. Words formed as if whispered into the air. There are two kinds of memory, one you inherit, and one you choose to carry. Belle touched the page, and a warmth spread through her fingers, climbing into her chest, making her knees weak. She closed the book gently and turned to leave, but the door was gone. In its place stood the beast. He did not speak right away. He stepped forward, slow and careful, his eyes watching her as one might watch a star about to fall. "You found the room of memory," he said. Belle nodded. "Was I meant to?" His silence was not heavy, but thoughtful. "Not yet," he said, "but perhaps it's time." He looked at the mirrors, his reflection flickering differently in each one. "This place keeps what I can't forget, and shows what I refuse to see." Belle looked at him, really looked, and saw not a monster but a man shaped by time, guilt, and longing. "Why?" she asked. "Because memory is the root of the curse," he said. "Not just mine, everyone's." They sat there for a long time, not speaking. When they finally left the chamber, the halls had changed again. Flowers bloomed along the banister, soft, glowing flowers that whispered lullabies in languages older than seasons. Belle felt the castle trembling beneath her skin now, not in fear, but in anticipation. Something was coming. She began to explore more deeply, walking paths the beast said even he hadn't entered in years. In the western tower, she found a room filled with feathers, suspended in the air like a blizzard frozen mid-flight. In the dungeon, she found mirrors covered in black velvet. When she touched one, a voice cried out, not hers, not his, but another, distant and feminine. It whispered a name she didn't recognize, Lizelle. She told the beast that night what she had heard. He grew still, then left without a word. She didn't follow. Instead, she sat in the library, surrounded by books that rearranged themselves as if trying to find the right one. Finally, one fell from a high shelf and landed at her feet. It had no title. When she opened it, she found only a single sentence written in silver ink. "To love a rose is to know it will fall." She closed the book and looked toward the darkened window. Outside, the moon was full and low, and the rose beneath its dome had lost another petal. The next morning, she found the beast waiting in the dining hall. He had never waited for her before. His eyes were distant, his voice quiet. "Lizelle," he said before she could speak. "She was the first to curse me. Not with magic, but with truth." Belle sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. "Was she the one who gave you the rose?" "No," he said. "The rose is older than her, older than me. It was given to my family generations ago, passed down through kings and cowards. It was never meant to bloom. He leaned forward, his voice breaking like frost beneath a step. But I made it bloom, and that was my mistake. He told her then, slowly, carefully, about the girl he had once loved. A sorceress with eyes like thunder and hands that made things grow or rot, depending on how they were held. She had loved him also not for his crown, but for his laughter. And he, in turn, had promised her everything except the one thing she truly needed, his honesty. He had hidden his fear of weakness, his ambition, his shame. And when she found out, she did not scream or cry. She simply left, leaving behind the curse, not of transformation, but of stillness. She didn't make me a beast, he said. She made me a mirror, and the castle became the reflection. Belle listened, not with pity, but with something quieter, deeper. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. We are all, she thought, shaped by what we try to bury. That evening, the beast asked her to dance. It was a strange request, awkwardly given, without ceremony. But she said yes. In the ballroom, music began to play, though no instrument could be seen. The ceiling opened to the sky, and stars shone down like watching eyes. They moved slowly, carefully, his hands trembling with the fear of breaking something fragile. But she guided him gently, her steps steady. And somewhere in the middle of that dance, the castle changed again. Lights flickered on in rooms long closed. Paintings realigned themselves. A fountain began to run. And the rose glowing now like a second, sun held its final petals a little tighter. Belle dreamed that night not of the past, but of what could be. She saw the castle filled with laughter, with light, with children running through the halls. She saw the beast not as he was, but as he could become. And in the center of it all stood the rose, blooming not as a countdown, but as a promise. But dreams are fragile, and even magic has shadows. The next day, a crack appeared in the dome that held the rose. The first fracture, and with it came the vision so clear and sudden it struck Belle still in the middle of the hall. She saw her father, lost in the forest, stumbling, coughing, crying her name. She saw the village in panic, fires lit, torches raised. And then she saw something else, a stranger. A man with cruel eyes and a silver blade standing at the edge of the woods, watching the castle as if he had always known where it stood. She ran to the beast, breathless, heart pounding. "My father," she said, "he's in danger. He's looking for me." The beast went still. "If you leave now," he said, "you may never return." Belle met his gaze. "If I don't leave, he may die." He didn't try to stop her. Instead, he led her to the edge of the rose chamber where the air shimmered like heat above a fire. He touched the glass dome, and a door appeared in the wall behind them. "This path leads to him," he said. "You have one day, then the rose will fall." Belle stepped forward. "Will I remember you if I never return?" His answer was soft. "Only in the parts of your heart that still dream." She turned, stepped through, and the door closed behind her. The wind was colder outside the castle walls. Not cruel, but ordinary, real in a way Belle hadn't felt in weeks. She stepped from the shimmering doorway into the forest, where snow had begun to fall, not heavily, but in slow drifting spirals that seemed unsure of whether they wished to land. The sky was a pale gray, streaked with the last gold of a waning sun. Behind her, the doorway vanished with a soft sound like a breath drawn inward, and the air felt immediately emptier. She walked quickly at first, boots crunching on dry leaves and patches of frost, her breath visible in the growing chill. Each step forward tugged at her chest, a thread pulling tighter the farther she went. The forest no longer felt quite like home. The trees were thinner than she remembered, the birds quieter. Even the earth beneath her feet seemed unsure of her. But she pressed on, following a path that felt more carved by memory than by map. She found her father just before nightfall, huddled beneath a crumbled tree arch, his coat torn and his lantern long cold. He was shivering, one boot missing, his face pale and lined deeper than she recalled. But when he saw her, when his eyes opened and he whispered her name, Belle felt the ache in her chest break wide open. She ran to him, wrapping her arms around him, holding his face between her hands as tears spilled from both of them. "I thought I'd lost you," he murmured, voice raw. "I followed your voice. I kept dreaming of you." She didn't tell him she hadn't called out, didn't explain how the castle might have let him glimpse her across its strange boundary. She only said, "I'm here. I've got you." They made their way slowly back toward the village, where the world was waiting in a way Belle had not prepared for. She had left quietly, months ago by village time, but the town had not stayed still. Rumors had spread like wildfire. The baker's wife claimed Belle had been taken by wolves. The blacksmith whispered that magic had returned to the woods. A man named Reynard had arrived just days earlier, a tall and imposing figure, with sharp eyes and a colder smile, claiming to be a hunter of cursed things. He had rallied the villagers with stories of dark enchantments and whispered promises of restoring safety. When Belle stepped into the square, weary and muddy, she was not welcomed with open arms, but with silence and then suspicion. "She's touched," someone muttered. "Cursed," another added. Belle stood tall despite the whispers, her father leaning against her, his strength returning slowly but not fully. She tried to explain how she had gone willingly, how the beast was not what they thought, how the castle was not a trap but a place of forgotten magic. But the more she spoke, the more fear she saw in their eyes. Reynard stepped forward from the crowd then, his cloak stirring behind him like a serpent. "She speaks in riddles," he said, voice smooth as polished stone, "and returns from a place no one has ever seen and lived to tell. Should we not question what she brings back with her?" Belle's gaze locked with his, steady and unafraid. "I bring truth," she said. "Not all cages have bars, and not all beasts wear claws." Reynard smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. He addressed the crowd, weaving his words like a net. He spoke of old legends, of the cursed prince who had once ruled those lands with arrogance and pride. He described the castle as a lair of enchantment where beauty was lured to its doom. He pointed to Belle as the proof of danger, twisted not with horns or fangs, but with love a magic more dangerous than any spell. Belle listened, her heart beating like a warning bell. She realized then that Reynard had not come to rescue, had come to destroy. Not out of justice, but out of hunger. He hunted not beasts, but stories. And the castle held a story older than he could bear to let live. That night, Belle sat with her father beside the fire, wrapping his wounds and brewing the same herbal tea he used to make for her when storms kept her awake. "He's not what they say," she whispered. Her father looked at her, eyes kind but tired. "I know, little one, but fear is easier to believe than truth, especially when truth asks us to change." Belle didn't sleep that night. She watched the fire burn low, thinking of the beast off his voice in the garden, of his hands trembling as they danced, of the rose with its final petals clinging to the stem. She felt something in her shift like a compass turning. At dawn, before the village stirred, she packed what little she needed and kissed her father's forehead. "I'll be back," she said, with the truth, but she wasn't fast enough. As she neared the forest's edge, she saw smoke on the horizon. Not campfire, smoke thicker, darker. Her breath caught. She ran. Branches clawed at her dress. Roots threatened to trip her, but she didn't stop. The forest itself seemed to resist her. The wind sharp, the path unclear. She reached the clearing just in time to see the castle under siege. Torches burned in a circle around the base. Arrows flew like angry birds into the towers. Reynard stood at the edge of the moat, shouting orders, his silver blade gleaming with a hunger not meant for beasts but for blood. The castle did not roar in response. It did not strike back. It stood still, silent, as though unsure whether to defend itself or let the story end. Belle screamed his name, the beast's name, but it was swallowed by the wind. She pushed through the line of villagers, dodging the guards, her body acting faster than thought. She crossed the bridge just as it cracked beneath flame. Inside, the castle moaned not in pain but in mourning. Paintings wept oil. The chandeliers dropped their light. And in the rose chamber she found him, the beast, collapsed to his knees beside the glass dome, one hand pressed against the final petal, the other reaching as if to hold something that wasn't there. He looked up as she entered, his eyes dull and far away. "I waited," he said. "I believed." She ran to him, falling to her knees. "I came back," she said. "I never meant to leave you." He closed his eyes, as if her voice were both comfort and curse. The final petal trembled. Outside, she heard Reynard's voice closer now, echoing through the hall. "Give me the heart of the curse," he shouted, "and I will spare the rest." Belle turned to the beast. "What is the heart?" she asked. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the truth fully in his eyes. "You," he said. "It was always you." She stood then and faced the doors as Reynard burst through. He saw her and smiled, blade drawn. "Step aside," he said. "The creature dies tonight." But Belle did not move. She lifted her chin and spoke the truth she had carried all this time. The curse was never his. It was yours, all of yours. Fear, judgment, refusal to see. The castle began to tremble. Light bled from the cracks in the walls. The mirrors in the halls shattered, not from violence but from release. The rose lifted from its stem, floating into the air. Reynard lunged, but the blade never found its mark. The light from the rose flared outward, a pulse that wrapped the room in golden silence. And in that moment, time stopped. The rose dissolved not in death, but in transformation. The petals became light, the stem a thread of song, and the dome vanished entirely. The beast rose, his body changing not into a man, but into the truest version of himself. Not quite human, not quite beast, but something in between, oval, radiant, whole. His eyes found Belle's, and for a moment, nothing else existed. She walked to him not as savior, not as sacrifice, but as herself, as love, returned and blooming. Outside, the villagers fell silent as the castle changed, not crumbling, but awakening. Vines with flowers of light curled around its towers. The air grew warm, the walls breathed again, and Reynard, stripped of his stories, vanished like smoke and wind. Belle and the beast stood side by side, no longer prisoner and captor, no longer cursed and redeemer, but two hearts who had chosen each other, not despite their scars, but because of them. The castle slept for 2 days after the light rose and the roar of change quieted. Not in slumber exactly, but in a kind of peaceful stillness, as though it had drawn its first full breath in centuries and wished to savor it. Belle stayed, though she might have left. The gates stood open now, the halls lit with soft golden hues. No enchantments tangled her steps, but she did not go. The beast no longer quite a beast, yet not the man from her village dreams. Either remained in the rose chamber, kneeling where the flower had vanished. He said little. His eyes held storms, but not the violent kind. These were the slow, heavy clouds that gather over fields in late autumn, waiting for something to break them open. Belle walked the corridors while the castle healed. She spoke with the servants more visible now, no longer enchanted objects, but people caught in a quiet fog of memory. A cook who remembered stirring soup with a wooden spoon that once sang. A stable boy who dreamed nightly of hooves echoing in marble halls. A librarian who wept when the books began humming again. None remembered their transformations clearly. Only shadows of time passed, but each one looked at Belle with the same expression, not born of magic, but of witnessing someone who had dared to stay, The west wing, once sealed by thorns and silence, began to open. Doors unlocked, curtains uncurled. Belle found a room filled with music boxes, each one playing a different lullaby in a different key, as if the walls had once danced to their discord. Another room held paintings half finished of faces she did not know, and in the highest tower she found something unexpected, a journal, bound in blue velvet, its spine cracked. The pages held a delicate script she recognized immediately was the beast's handwriting from before, when he had still gone by another name, a name he did not yet speak aloud. She took the journal with trembling hands, unsure if she had the right to open it. But that night, as rain fell soft against the windows, and the fire in her hearth whispered low, she did. And within its pages she met him all over again. He had once been a boy who loved stars more than crowns, who planted roses in secret gardens behind the stables, who wrote letters he never sent to a mother lost too young, to a brother gone to war, to himself, asking who he might become. The pages grew darker as they turned. Anger, loss, shame, a palace that grew larger while his heart shrank. The moment Lysel left him was written in ink so heavy it bled through 3 pages, and after that, nothing. Blankness, as if he had stopped being a person and become only echo. Belle closed the book gently and brought it to him the next morning. He sat in the garden now, where roses bloomed untamed, not contained by glass, but curling freely through columns and cracks. When she offered him the journal, he did not speak. He only looked at her, then at the cover. "I thought I burned this," he said. "You buried it," she replied softly, "but it waited for you anyway." He took it from her with both hands, not like a burden, but like something fragile and beloved. His eyes grew wet. "I don't know who I am," he whispered. Belle smiled. "Then let's find out together." And so they began again. Mornings came with quiet breakfasts in the courtyard, where the sun made dappled patterns on stone and vines, leaned toward the warmth. The beast who no longer needed to be called so, though no other name fit quite right, yet walked with her through the grounds. He showed her secret places he'd once feared to enter. She told him stories of her childhood, of her mother's lullabies and the way her father had taught her to mend clocks. In the evenings they read to each other, books both ancient and new, poems that made her cry, fables that made him laugh for the first time in what felt like lifetimes. And slowly the distance between them closed, not with grand declarations or enchanted gestures, but with glances held longer than necessary, with silences that felt full instead of empty. One afternoon, they found themselves in the music room. Belle sat at the harpsichord, her fingers hesitant. "I never learned properly," she said. "My mother played, but I only remember pieces." He sat beside her, gently laying his clawless yet still large and calloused hand over hers. "Try," he said. "Even broken songs are still music." And so she played, hesitantly at first, then stronger. Notes danced unevenly, tumbling into each other. He closed his eyes and listened, not for perfection, but for the sound of her. And when she finished, he whispered, "Beautiful." She looked at him. "Even the wrong notes?" "Especially those," he said. "They're the ones you meant." But the peace did not hold forever. One day, a raven arrived, black as spilled ink, its eyes silver. It landed on the castle gates and would not enter. Belle approached it cautiously, and it opened its beak not to caw, but to speak. "The mirror is broken," it said. "The past is leaking." And then it buzzed into feathers and vanished. The message troubled the beast more than he admitted. That night, he stood at the mirror in the rose chamber, the one that once showed him whatever he most feared. For years it had reflected only himself, but now it showed something else, a forest burning, a tower crumbling, and in the center, a woman with eyes like starlight. "Lysel, she's returned," he said. "Not for revenge, for reckoning." Belle listened, heart quiet. "You're not who you were," she said, "and she may not be either." He looked at her, pain flickering behind his eyes. "But I broke her," he whispered, "and broken magic always seeks its mirror." The days that followed grew strange. The castle walls began to hum at night, low and constant, like a heart trying to remember how to beat. Rooms shifted again, not violently, but with intention, as if preparing, as if bracing. Belle began to dream of silver trees and a garden of moons. She woke with strange words on her tongue, names she had never heard but felt familiar. The servants grew quieter, watching the horizon as though expecting a visitor. One evening, the sky turned violet, not from sunset but from something older. A shimmer spread over the land, and in the garden, the first rose planted by Belle herself bloomed black. The beast watched it with unreadable eyes. "It's beginning," he said. "What is?" she asked. "The second part of the curse." Belle stared at him. "I thought it was broken." He looked at her, sorrow etched into every line of his face. "No," he said, "that was only the part we could touch. This part lives in memory, in what we left unsaid." That night, the stars pulsed like candles about to blow out. Belle dreamed of Lysel standing in the room of mirrors, touching each one. "He lied to you too," she said, "but it's not too late." When Belle woke, the castle was silent. The beast was gone. She searched for him, heart pounding, room by room, wing by wing, until she found the secret door again, the one that led to the Chamber of Constellations. It had returned, and inside she found not just mirrors now, but portals, each one leading to a different memory, his, hers, and some that did not belong to either. She stepped toward one glowing gold and saw a version of herself standing before the villagers, speaking without fear. In another, she saw the beast as a child, burying a letter in the garden. She watched, she wept, and she understood. He had gone back into memory, into the heart of what he had broken, to face what still lingered. And she would follow. The air inside the Chamber of Constellations was thick with a silence that felt older than the castle itself. Belle stood among the mirrors turned portals, the light of distant stars glimmering above her head like a sky built of memories. The portal that had shown the beast as a boy now pulsed faintly, as if urging her forward. Without hesitation, she stepped into it. At first, it was like falling, but not downward. She fell inward, her heartbeat slowing to the rhythm of a memory not her own. And when her feet touched ground again, she was in a garden she'd never seen, yet somehow knew. The roses here were still young, just buds, and the hedges were not yet overgrown. A boy, perhaps 10 years old, knelt in the soil, pressing a letter into the earth and patting it gently with shaking hands. Belle moved closer, unseen, as the scene unfolded. "Please," he whispered into the dirt. "If magic is real, let her hear me. Let her know I didn't mean it." Tears streaked his face, and Belle's heart ached with a tenderness she didn't understand. Then, in the corner of the memory, she saw another figure, Lysel, younger, ethereal, watching from behind the hedge. She did not approach him. She simply turned and walked away. The memory blurred, dissolved, and reformed. Now Belle stood in a grand hall, filled with music and silk and gold. A celebration. A prince elder now, his voice lower, his posture sharper, danced with partner after partner, yet never smiled. His eyes kept drifting toward a door that never opened. When it finally did, Lysel entered, not in anger, but with a quiet dignity. She walked straight past him to the throne, set down a small wooden box, and said only, "This belonged to the boy you buried." Then she left. The music stuttered, the dancers paused, and the prince did nothing. Belle reached out to touch the box, but the memory collapsed again, the edges turning dark as storm clouds gathered overhead. This time she landed in a room made of glass mirrors on every wall, ceiling, floor. No doors, just endless reflections, and in each a different version of the beast, angry, ashamed, kind, lost. None of them turned to face her. She called out his Naminat, the one the world knew, but the one she had never asked. Oren, she said, and the sound rippled through the space like a stone cast into a still lake. One reflection turned, then another, and then he was there, not behind glass, but beside her. Oren, not beast, not boy, not prince, just him. He looked tired. The kind of tired that settles in the bones. You found me, he said, voice hoarse. I was afraid I'd stay here. Bell reached for his hand. We go back together. He shook his head. There's more. I have to show you something. The mirrors shuddered, and a new door appeared, this one, arched and carved with thorns. He opened it, and they stepped through. They stood in a throne room darker than any she had seen, not just dim but full of shadows that moved. At the center was Lyselle, not a ghost, not a memory present. Her eyes glowed with the same violet hue that had spread across the sky days ago. So, she said, you come willingly now. Oren stepped forward. I came to end it. Lyselle tilted her head. You think this is something you can end? This isn't a spell, Oren. It's a mirror, one you've refused to face. Bell stepped beside him. Then let us face it. Lyselle studied her for a moment. You love him. It wasn't a question. I see, she said softly. Then maybe you can survive what comes next. The room shifted. Columns crumbled. Wind howled through unseen cracks. The shadows around Lyselle lifted from the floor, revealing not monsters but people. People who had once served the prince, people forgotten, people cursed in silence while he brooded in his sorrow. Do you see them? Lyselle whispered. He was not the only one broken. Belle looked, and her breath caught. She recognized faces from the castle servants, whose eyes still bore the weight of time lost. I see them, she said, and I will remember them. Oren turned to them, each face. He met their gaze. I was wrong, he said. I let grief twist me into something cruel. I thought I was the only one hurting. But I see you now. I'm sorry. The air grew still. The shadows paused. And then Lyselle stepped down from the dais. Sometimes, she said, the curse isn't lifted by love returned, but by truth spoken. That was all I wanted, all I waited for. She placed her hand on his heart. You are not who you were, but you must carry who you were. That is the price and the gift. The throne room dissolved into light, not harsh, not blinding warm like morning. When Belle opened her eyes, they were back in the rose chamber. The mirrors were gone. The stars had quieted. And Oren stood beside the he of toddler somehow. Lighter, not healed completely, but healing. She looked at him and he looked back, and no words were needed. Outside, spring had arrived. The castle gardens bloomed with colors Belle had never seen before, roses with petals like moonlight, lilies that opened to hum lullabies. The servants moved freely, laughing softly, telling stories like people waking from a long sleep. Belle wandered among them, planting new seeds, rebuilding walls with vines rather than stone. Oren joined her often, not to lead, but to listen. Together, they crafted a place that belonged to neither past nor fairy tale place, real enough to grow in. One evening, as fireflies blinked above the fountains and the stars returned to their silent vigil, Belle and Oren sat beneath the old rose tree. You know, he said, there's still magic left in the world. She smiled. I know. I see it every time you look at me. He turned to her, something uncertain in his gaze. What comes next? She took his hand, fingers threading through his. Whatever we choose, she said. Not a curse, not a legend, just us. And for the first time, in a very long time, he believed her. The days that followed unfolded like petals, long curled tight slowly, gently, in colors soft and unfamiliar. Time had been strange for so long inside the castle's walls that neither Belle nor Oren noticed at first how it moved differently now. Meals came with sunlight, and not the flicker of enchanted candles. Seasons slipped in through open windows instead of looming like old ghosts. The roses in the garden, Belle's roses, grew in directions no one expected, spiraling upward toward the turrets and clinging to stone as if claiming the castle for something new. Belle woke each morning in a bed she had once thought too grand to ever feel like hers, and each night she fell asleep beside a man who was still learning how to be seen. Oren moved through the halls with less hesitation now, no longer flinching at his reflection, no longer keeping to the shadows. There was scarce some visible, some not, but he bore them without shame. Belle never asked him to forget, only to stay, and he did, more fully each day. They took to walking the grounds in the evenings, just after the last flush of sunset faded from the sky. Sometimes they spoke of books, of childhood, of silly things like soup recipes or the curious habits of foxes. Other times they were quiet, and the silence between them stretched warm and easy, like a familiar blanket on a cool night. Oren found joy in small things. The first time he fixed a broken railing with his own hands. The first time a sparrow landed near him without fear. The first time he made Belle laugh so hard she spilled tea all over the table. And Belle, too, discovered parts of herself she hadn't known were waiting. How she loved singing to the roses when no one else was listening. How her hands itched for paint, though she'd never trained. How fiercely she wanted to build not just a home, but a legacy of gentleness. Together, they began tending to more than just the castle. They ventured to the nearby village first in secret, cloaked and careful, and then, slowly, as themselves. The villagers were wary at first. Stories had a way of rooting deep, and the tale of the cursed castle was tangled in fear and fantasy. But Belle spoke with kindness, and Oren, when he did speak, spoke with honesty, and that made all the difference. Children were the first to befriend them. Curious and unafraid, they came bearing wildflowers and questions. Why is your hair like a lion's? Can roses talk? Did you really eat a chandelier? Oren answered them all, with the patience of someone who remembered what it felt like to have no one to ask. Soon the villagers began to come too. First the old herbalist, who needed help rebuilding her greenhouse. Then the baker, whose son had fallen ill and needed herbs found only near the castle's lake. Belle helped, Oren helped, and slowly the walls between them and the world began to crumble, not with force, but with care. And yet, peace does not erase all fears. One night, as stars blinked like watchful eyes, and the wind carried the scent of jasmine through the open windows, Belle dreamed. She stood at the base of a vast staircase, one that seemed to rise forever, lined with mirrors and veils. A single rose floated above her head, its petals blackening one by one. From the top of the stairs, a voice called Lazelle's voice, but thinner, fading. Not all curses end, it said. Some bloom anew. Belle woke with a start, her heart loud in her chest. Across the room, Oren stirred. What is it? He asked, voice still heavy with sleep. She shook her head, unable to explain. The dream lingered like smoke. In the days that followed, small things began to feel strange again. The music room, once filled with gentle sound, fell silent. The roses near the eastern wall withered suddenly, as if touched by frost. A book Belle had left open was found closed with a single thorn on the page. Oren felt it too, a tension in the stone, a hush in the halls. The castle was breathing again, yes, but now it seemed to be holding its breath. They searched for signs, but there was no magic to trace, no spell to unravel, and yet something had shifted. Lazelle had said the curse lived in memory, in what was left unsaid. Had they not spoken enough? Had they missed a fragment of the truth? Belle returned to the Chamber of Constellations. but the portals were gone. Only stars remained, and among them, one new, one bright red, pulsing faintly, almost like a warning. Oren, restless, began writing again. He filled page after page with thoughts, confessions, apologies to people long gone, reflections he didn't know how to share aloud. Bell read them with his permission and wept for the boy inside the man still learning to be whole. "I want to do more than be forgiven," he wrote in one letter. "I want to be worthy." She folded the note into her journal. "You already are," she whispered. But the castle trembled again that night, barely a breath, but enough to rattle the lanterns. They summoned the librarian, a woman who had once been a candle holder, and together they began poring through every book of enchantment and history in the great library. Somewhere, they reasoned, the answer must lie. Days passed like pages. Belle barely slept. Oren skipped meals. They found records of curses that came in layers like nesting dolls, each sealed within the other. Curses tied to names, curses tied to blood, curses that only bloomed once the first had faded. And then, finally, a single line in an ancient, brittle journal. "When the beast is no longer beast, the mirror will no longer hold the sorrow that made him." Belle read the line aloud, then again. "The sorrow," she said slowly, "was never just his." Oren stood very still. "Then whose was it?" The librarian looked up from the shadows. "The one who cast it," she said, "and the one who broke it, together. It was Belle." Of course it was. Not her fault, not her curse, but her heart that had woven into its undoing, and now it seemed into its echo, for in healing Oren, she had taken in some of the sorrow herself, and sorrow, when untended, begins to bloom. That night, she walked alone to the rose tree. The moon was high, casting silver light across the courtyard. She knelt before the first black-bloomed one from the day the raven came, and without hesitation, she touched it. Pain like memory surged through her, not just hers, all of it. Lysel's grief, Oren's shame, the villagers' fear, the servants' years lost, the castle's silent watching. It moved through her like wind through branches, and she did not resist. She let it burn, let it whisper, let it go. And when it passed, the rose crumbled to ash. In its place, a seed. Behind her, Oren approached. "You weren't meant to carry it," he said. Belle stood slowly. "Maybe not," she said, "but I can plant what comes after." He knelt beside her, his hand over hers, and together they pressed the seed into the soil. Something stirred beneath the ground, something not of curses, not of magic, but of choice, of love that faced truth, of sorrow that had been seen. And for the first time since the rose was placed beneath glass, the earth exhaled. The days that followed were quiet in a way that didn't feel like peace, but like the breath drawn before something breaks. Belle tended to the garden every morning, her fingers deep in the soil, eyes on the spot where the seed had been planted. Nothing had yet sprouted, not a curl of green, not a hint of root end, yet she came, faithfully, as if it were her own heart beneath the earth. Oren watched from the terrace sometimes, a book in hand, but he rarely turned the pages. He was reading her more than any words, her shoulders, her silences, the way her laughter had softened, then gone. The castle, too, had changed again. The light came in as before, but it held a strange stillness, as if it no longer touched the walls quite the same. The servants whispered, not from fear, but from reverences, though something sacred had entered their halls, and none dared disturb it. The chandelier never swayed, the clocks all slowed, the mirrors dulled, losing their gleam as though memory itself had decided to sleep. Belle spoke less, not out of sorrow exactly, but as though speech had become a language too rough for the soft ache inside her. She wandered more, into the older corners of the castle, the forgotten music alcoves, the spiral staircases that led nowhere, the tapestries frayed with centuries of breath. She moved like someone searching for something they could not name. Oren followed, at a distance at first, then beside her. They walked in silence, hand in hand, two shadows trailing candlelight, bound not by enchantment anymore, but by a kind of love that had passed through fire and emerged gentler for it. One evening, Belle found herself in the old gallery, where portraits lined the walls like ghosts painted into oil. She paused before one she had never noticed before, a young woman in green velvet, a rose pinned to her throat, her eyes the color of dusk. "My mother," Oren said behind her. "She died before the curse, before anything." Belle turned. She was beautiful. "She was sad," he replied. "She never let anyone say it, but I knew." He stepped beside her, eyes fixed on the woman in the frame. "I think the sadness got passed down like a crown, heavy, unwanted." Belle looked up at him. "And yet you carry it differently." He met her gaze. "Because of you." She shook her head. "No," she whispered. "Because of you." They lingered there, in front of a woman neither of them could remember clearly, but who somehow lived in both of their silences. Outside, the wind picked up, not fierce, but low, like humming, the kind of wind that rattles shutters gently, not to scare but to remind. That night, Belle dreamed again. This time there were no mirrors, no roses, just water deep, endless and still. She stood on its surface, barefoot, weightless, and beneath her feet she could see faces, smiling, sleeping, weeping, her own among them, Oren's, Lizelle's. And the voice came again, not a warning this time, but a song. Not sung aloud, but remembered. To love is not to rescue. To love is to remain. She woke with tears already on her cheeks, and Aaron's arms wrapped around her like a harbor holding back the sea. In the days after, the seed in the garden began to stir. First a single stem, too fragile to name. Then leaves, bright as emerald and soft as breath. It wasn't a rose. It wasn't anything they recognized. But it grew each day, curling toward the sun, as if nourished by more than soil be forgiveness, by truth, by the kind of love that grows in the quiet after the storm. Belle sat beside it for hours, speaking sometimes, humming often, simply existing, and the plant listened, its leaves turned toward her voice, its stem bending to her presence. Oren, too, found a rhythm, again helping the villagers build a library in the square, offering bread from their kitchen, joining Belle in reading stories to children beneath the willow tree near the gate. He began writing a book, not a diary, not a confession, but a tale, a fairy tale perhaps, or something truer. A boy who became a beast, not because he was cursed, but because he forgot how to be loved. A girl who taught him by refusing to run. He read each chapter to Belle at dusk, and she offered no edits, only quiet tears and a hand in his. But with every page he read, the wind in the castle grew quieter, more reverent, as if even the stones were listening. One afternoon, an owl appeared at the gate. White as bone, with feathers like lace, it carried a single note tied to its leg. No name, no signature. Just a line, written in ink that shimmered violet when held to the light. When grief is given a name, it begins to bloom differently. Belle tucked the note into her journal, beside Oren's old letters, beside a dried petal from the first cursed rose. "Thyself," she whispered. Not a threat, not a warning, a farewell. That evening, Belle stood before the strange new flower in the garden and saw for the first time what it had become. Not a bloom, but a flame. Petals like glass, veins of gold, a shimmer that pulsed with memory and hope. Not cursed, not enchanted, alive. And when she reached to touch it, it did not burn. It sang, not with notes, but with warmth, with truth. Oren came to stand beside her. "Do you think it has a name?" he asked softly. Belle turned to him, hands still on the stem. "It doesn't need one," she said. "It just needs to be seen." That night, for the first time in many, Belle laughed. Not softly, not carefully. Loud and wild and unshaped by sorrow, Oren watched her like someone seeing the stars move for the first time. "You've always been magic," he said, even before the castle knew it. She touched his cheek. "So have you," she replied, "even when you couldn't see it." And as the moon rose over the garden, casting silver light upon the soil, the two of them stood hand in hand, watching something new and ancient bloom in silence. Love not as a rescue, but as a return. Time, once frozen and then fractured, began to move again in soft, even threads. The days unfolded not with drama, but with gentleness, the slow unfolding of mornings, scented with tea and honey, the quiet rustle of pages in the library, the brushing of fingers as Belle and Oren passed each other in doorways worn smooth by footsteps and time. The garden had become their sanctuary, not because it was enchanted or mysterious, but because it was theirs. The strange bloom that had sprouted from sorrow's seed now stood at the heart of it, taller than Belle, glowing faintly by day and pulsing with a soft warmth by night. It was neither rose, nor flame, nor miraculite, but simply what remained after everything else had fallen away. Around it, Belle planted new flowers, daisies for innocence, lavender for peace, golden alyssum for trust, and each one took root easily, as if the ground itself had been waiting for something soft to hold. Oren carved a bench beside the flower, built with his own hands, shaped from old beams taken from a part of the castle he and Belle no longer needed. The west wing, the place where fear had once lived. It was now quiet, sealed gently, not with resentment, but with grace. A room full of memory, left undisturbed, like a story they had finally finished reading. Sometimes Belle and Oren would sit in the garden long past sunset, saying nothing, letting the warmth of the strange flower bathe them in its light as the stars blinked awake overhead. The servants, once caught in enchantment, now moved freely through the castle. They laughed more, sang often, and looked at Belle not as a guest, but as the heart of the home. The village, too, had changed, no longer whispering about the castle's curse, but instead about Belle's kindness, Oren's quiet generosity, and the strange new warmth in the wind that seemed to drift down from the castle's highest towers. Children played at its gates without fear, calling it the Rose Castle, a name Belle found herself smiling at whenever she heard it. And through it all, a gentle ache settled into the spaces between Belle's ribs, not pain, not regret, but the echo of something unfinished. She had found love, yes, she had helped break a curse, but something remained, an invitation, perhaps, from life itself. One evening, after a quiet supper and a longer walk, Belle turned to Oren beneath the old willow tree. "Do you ever wonder what's next?" she asked. He tilted his head, brushing her hair back gently. "Not in fear," she added. "Just wondering if this is all." Oren didn't answer immediately. He looked up through the leaves, where the sky was streaked with the first light of stars. "I used to think all meant safety," he said. "Then I thought it meant forgiveness. Then you came, and I thought it meant love. But now I think all just means what we choose to grow." Belle leaned into him. "And what do you want to grow?" she whispered. He smiled slowly. "A future, with you." Her heart stilled, not out of fear, but because something long quiet within her stirred like a book that had been closed for too long. In the weeks that followed, Belle began sketching new plans. Not for escape, not for freedom, but for creation. She dreamed of opening the castle gates for good, not just to let others in, but to let what she and Oren had built flow outward. She imagined classes taught in the great hall, music drifting through the old chapel, gardens tended by many hands, laughter in the kitchens, and books passed from child to child with wonder in their eyes. Not a kingdom, not a fairy tale, a home, a sanctuary, a library for those who had forgotten how to hope. a refuge for those who believed they had no place left to go, a haven where sorrow was not banished but named and, in naming, gently transformed. Oren supported her, of course quietly, fully helping build shelves, mend windows, send invitations to villages farther than they'd ever traveled. People came, slowly at first. A girl who had stopped speaking after losing her parents, a soldier who refused to touch anything metal, a seamstress with hands that trembled from grief. Belle welcomed them with tea and open arms, and Oren taught them how to prune roses, how to bake bread, how to sit still without shame. The castle filled again not with glamour, not with grandeur, but with life. And in the silence of those new days, Belle sometimes stood in the garden and watched the flower at its center shimmer in the wind, and she thought, this is what it was always meant to become. Not a place to hide, a place to begin. And though she no longer dreamed of mirrors or staircases, she sometimes heard the song of the rose in her sleep flower, tender, unfinished, as if it too was waiting for something more, not sorrow, not warning, a calling. And Belle, hand in Oren's, heart steady and open, was finally ready to answer. The morning light that rose over the castle on the day of the celebration was soft gold, like butter melting on warm bread, and the air hummed not with enchantment but with joy, the ordinary kind that comes when people remember who they are and where they belong. The garden had bloomed into a mosaic of color and scent, and at its heart, the strange glowing flowers stood tall and still, no longer pulsing with the uncertainty of mystery, but shining gently like a lighthouse watching over home. Belle stood at her window before the world woke, the hem of her gown brushing her ankles, her hair loose down her back, and she watched the trees sway as birds stitched light between their branches. Behind her, Oren stirred, reaching across the bed, not in panic or loneliness, but simply to find her, always to find her. When his hand met empty linen, he smiled and rose to follow her, not needing to ask where she had gone. They met in the garden without words, their hands finding each other like pages pressed together, and for a moment neither moved, letting the silence between them speak its quiet, enormous truth. They had made it, not just through curses and grief and loss, but through the long, slow rebuilding of something real. The celebration wasn't grand, no banners, no trumpets, but people came from every path and village, some barefoot, some clothed in patched shawls, many carrying nothing but hope in their hands. The castle doors were open, the tables laid with bread and fruit and books, and music spilled from the windows like laughter echoing across hills. Children ran freely, their feet smudged with earth, their mouths sticky with honey, and in the library, a boy who had once feared his own voice read aloud to a circle of strangers who listened like it was scripture. Oren walked among them, not as a prince, not as a beast undone, but as a man who had chosen gentleness even when it had felt like weakness. And when he caught Belle's eye across the courtyard, it was like seeing the first sunrise after 1,000 nights of snow. They didn't need a ceremony, no crowns, no titles. They chose each other again with every step, every shared glance, every ordinary kindness. That evening, as lanterns were strung from tree to tree, and candles floated in the fountains like stars come to visit, Belle stood before the glowing flower in the garden, now surrounded by 1,000 smaller blooms, and she placed both hands around its stem. A hush fell, not commanded, but given, and as the petals trembled in her palms, the flower began to change, not to fade, not to die, but to release. The petals, one by one, lifted into the air, becoming light themselves, destiny flames that rose and circled the courtyard, brushing cheeks, warming hands, whispering something wordless and true into every open heart. And as the last petal left her hands, Belle understood. The flower had never been a curse. It had been waiting for her, for Oren, for all of them to see what love looked like after the magic ended. And what remained wasn't less. It was more. It was real. The light faded slowly, gently, and in its place, only a stem remained green, alive, and perfectly ordinary. A flower that had become a story that had become a home. That night, Belle and Oren sat beneath the willow tree, their fingers intertwined, the stars listening overhead. They spoke of Tomarnot with fear, but with warmth. A school in the East Wing, a traveling library for the mountain villages, a home for children without one, and maybe one day a child of their own born not into a fairy tale, but into a world rebuilt by courage and care. Belle rested her head on Oren's shoulder, and he kissed her hair. "You changed me," he whispered. She smiled without opening her eyes. "No," she said, "we grew together." The wind stirred the leaves, and somewhere far in the distance, a new story began to whisper through the branches. But here, in this garden, beneath this sky, everything was finally still. No enchantment, no disguise, only love blooming gently in the dark, and the soft, endless hush of forever beginning.